Good morning, everyone. I want to say a word of welcome to all of you who are worshiping with us in Amesbury. It is great to be coming to you as we continue this sermon series about second chances. So today, we're looking at the story of Jonah. Now, Jonah is one of those kind of interesting stories because it's really, in many ways, a multi-level story. I mean, we tell the story of Jonah as a children's story. Actually, most kids learn the story of Jonah. It's a story about a guy who gets swallowed by a big fish and travels around inside him for 3 days and gets spit up on the shore of a distant land. And it sort of sounds like an adventure story when we tell it at a children's level. But actually, there's a lot more to the story of Jonah. Jonah is really, in many ways, not much of a G-rated story. It's a story about sin and disobedience. It's a story about cataclysmic judgment on an entire city of people who have rebelled against God. It's a harsh story in some ways. It's a story of bitterness and Jonah's attitude towards these people and an unwillingness to go and share the hope of God with them, and to share the message of God of repentance. And so this is one of those stories that we really kind of need to look at several levels. But for our purposes during this sermon series, this is also a story of second chances. Certainly it's a story of second chances for the city of Nineveh. You know, Jonah, after being kind of coerced, if you will, encouraged strongly by God, ends up in Nineveh, and he does in fact bring this message, this very strong message from God to the people of Nineveh, and lo and behold, they hear it, and they receive it, and they repent of their sin, and they actually begin to turn back towards God, and it's really a very powerful, convicting story, I guess, of how we confront our sin and how God gives us a second chance. And so for the people of Nineveh, it is a second chance story. But you know what? It's also a second chance story for Jonah. I mean, you know, God calls him. If you know the story, and I suspect many of us do, you know that God calls him and says to him, I want you to be my prophet. I want you to go and bring a message. A prophet was one who brought a message from God. I want you to bring my message to these people in Nineveh. And Jonah's like, no way. There's no way I'm going to Nineveh. I know those people. They're wicked, awful, terrible people. And there's no way I'm going to Nineveh to bring any message from God or anyone else. And so what does he do? He gets on a boat that is going the exact opposite direction. And he takes off. And so he essentially runs away from his calling. God has called him. God has given him a job, if you will. He's given him a purpose. He said, this is what I believe I want you, this is what I know I want you to do, God is saying to him. And Jonah runs away from his calling. And in this story, God gives Jonah a second chance to fulfill his calling. He raises up this storm, and eventually Jonah confesses that he's the one that's the cause of all this mess, and in order to save the ship and the rest of the sailors, he allows himself to be thrown overboard. And God swallows him up with a big fish and spits him out right where he needs to be. Now at that point, God hasn't actually made Jonah give that testimony, but he's certainly given him a second chance. He's put him in that place where he was supposed to go. He says, all right, I'm telling you, you've got a chance to do the right thing. And so ultimately, much begrudgingly, Jonah does the right thing. He shares that message. And so it's a story really of a man who got a second chance to do what God was calling him to do. And this isn't an unfamiliar theme, actually. This idea of people sort of running away from their calling, not wanting to fulfill their calling. I mean, look at Moses. When God called Moses to go to the Pharaoh and to confront him and to require him to let God's people go, was Moses thrilled about that? Was Moses eager to go and do that? I don't think so. He started making up excuses, and I can't do it, and I'm not a good enough speaker, and who am I to do it, and all this stuff. And so Moses really tried his best to resist God's call. Oh, what about Gideon? Remember the story of Gideon? He's a timid man. And yet God calls him to lead the army of Israel into battle against the Midianites. He didn't want to do it. He was very hesitant to accept God's call. He resisted God's call on his life. I mean, in some ways, you could say the same thing of Mary, the mother of Jesus. When God spoke to her and said, by the Holy Spirit, you will bear a son, and his name will be Jesus, and he will be Savior of all. What was her response? Who am I to do such a thing? There was hesitancy there. She was not eager to rush into that. Now, of course, in those three situations, they didn't literally run the other direction the way Jonah did. They were resistant. They tried to push back on that call. But what I find is interesting is that with Jonah, even in spite of his disobedience, God was determined to give him a second chance. A second chance to do the right thing, a second chance to respond to the call, a second chance to use this word that he had been given to bring a message from God. And it might seem like somewhat of an extraordinary story when you think about all that had to happen in order for Jonah to be there in the right place at the right time to bring that message. It is. It's quite a story. But the underlying issue is more common than you might think. This whole issue of wanting to run away from God's calling. I can pretty much guarantee you there are people in this room today who have, at times in their lives, run away from God's calling. In fact, there may be some of you in this room today who are in the process of running away from God's calling. There may be those among us whom God is calling in some way to step out in faith, to do something for his sake, that are doing your best to push back, to ignore, to repress that calling from God. Why do we do that? Why would we do that? If God is calling us to something, why would we not jump right into it? Why would we be resistant? Well, I think the answers vary, but for some it may be like Mary, who just thinks this is too lofty a thing for me. This is too great a task for me. Who am I? Some of us may feel as though God is calling us in some way to do something great in our lives, and we think to ourselves, but who am I to do such a thing? I'm not the Apostle Paul. I'm not capable of some of these things. I'm not a Billy Graham. Who am I? We think it's too lofty for us. Or sometimes like Moses, we think to ourselves, we hear God's call, but we think to ourselves, I don't really have the skills. I don't speak well, is what Moses said. And some of us have probably said that at times when God has called us to go out and bring a message, to share a word. Sometimes I think we push back on God's call because we don't think we really have the skills to do it. Or some of us, like Jonah, just really don't want to. We don't like those people. Maybe God's called you to go in a certain area. We just don't like it. It's not something we think we're going to like or enjoy or want to do. And so sometimes we just resist God's call because we don't like the idea Somehow we think we know better than God. But you know, more often than not, beneath all of that is an underlying factor. You know what it is, right? It's Gideon's issue. It's fear. Underneath Mary's hesitancy is fear. Underneath Moses' hesitancy is fear. Underneath Gideon's hesitancy to lead the army is fear. And certainly underneath Jonah's hesitancy is fear. And I think often underneath our unwillingness or our resistance to follow God's call in our lives is fear. And sometimes we've put God off and we've refused to respond, and we've not followed his calling because we're afraid. We have fear of change. We have fear of risk, or fear of failure, or sometimes just a fear of the unknown. Where will this take me? Lord, what will this be like? You want me to go on the mission field? Seriously? We have that fear of the unknown. But you know, when we run away from our calling, when we refuse to do, when we choose not to do that which God has called us to, you understand that there is a price to be paid for that? You understand there's actually a pretty significant price to be paid when you or I refuse to respond to God's call, when we decide that we're not going to follow God's calling for us. Really, that falls into two big categories. There is the cost, the price of unmet need. When God calls us to do something, it's because there's a need there. He's leading us in a certain direction. Say, do this, because as a part of the advancement of my kingdom, some area of need, there's something unmet here. And I'm calling you. You and I are the hands and feet of Christ. You and I are the ones to go about and do the work of God. And so when we refuse to answer God's call, there are going to be unmet needs because we did not respond. And so there's a cost there. When God calls you to share generously with someone who's struggling to get by, the cost may be that their children go hungry that night. Or when God nudges you to speak the word of hope into someone's life, the cost might be a missed chance for that person. The flip side of that is that there's also a cost for us. When we refuse to answer God's call, not only is it a loss, a price to be paid for the person whose need perhaps was not met in that moment the way God desired it to be, but there's also a cost for us in terms of missed opportunity. God is inviting us to be in work with him, to partner with him. And it is the highest calling. It is the greatest thing in the world to have an opportunity to partner with God, to do his will, to do his work. And when we refuse to answer that call, we have lost an opportunity to do something great, to do something significant in our lives, something that's just going to matter. And because we ran away, because we got on a boat to Tarshish, we missed out on the experience that God had for us. God was going to shape us and mold us in that. God was going to enable us. Often the greatest experiences of life are those times when we step out in faith because God called us, not knowing exactly where we were going or what was going to be coming. But in the end, we look back on that and realize those were the greatest moments of my life. Those were the times when I was used most powerfully. Those were the times I felt so, my life mattered so significantly. And so here's what I want us to say. Here's what I want us to understand today. If you have run away from God's calling in your life, I want you to know that he's saying to you today, I am a God of second chances. God will give us a second chance to fulfill this calling. God will give us a second chance in some way to step out. Now, it may not look exactly like the first one. That moment may have passed. But I don't believe that just because that moment passed that God will never give us a chance again to be used of him in significant ways. Perhaps in the very similar ways to what he originally intended for us, but in a different timing in a different situation, a different circumstance. And so I want us to understand, just like we talked about God being a God of second chances in our areas of sin and when we betrayed him, I believe he also gives us a second chance when we have run away from our calling. He gives us a second chance to be used of him. And that's huge. That's huge. Many of you know John and Rachel Howard. They have been involved in ministry in our church for several years now. They've participated actually at all 3 campuses in one way or another, and so many of you have had a chance to meet them. I asked them to sit down with me and share a little bit of their testimony, their story in the area of calling. And I think you're going to find it very powerful as they share with you a little bit about how they have been called over the years and some of the ways that they have run away from God's calling. I invite you to just turn your attention to the video for a moment. Now, you guys know that this coming Sunday I'm going to be talking about Jonah. And there are a lot of aspects to that story, but one in particular we're going to be looking at is this whole idea of how Jonah kind of ran away from his calling, how he kind of avoided following the calling that God had given him. And I know from talking to you guys that you do have a calling from God on your lives. Tell us a bit about that.
For me, in particular, in 2002, I had a calling from God, and it was evident, very heavy. Brought it before the congregation and asked that they confirm that calling. So we did that, and I started preaching regularly. I was a deacon at that point, so I was involved in the service. Rachel had taken on a choir director role, but that being said, I ran away at a point.
Well, my calling, I mean, when I accepted Christ, we were later on. We weren't kids. We were, near our 30s, and the calling he had for me at that time was just service. I just knew that I had to serve in whatever way I could with whatever gifts I had. One time we had friends within the church who were really good friends, and they wound up leaving our old church, and one of the reasons they told someone was that we had too much Jesus. So, you know what? If that was a reason, I was
It's
okay
quite the
with
indictment,
that.
huh?
I was okay with that.
Yeah.
So my calling, at that point was just to serve and to serve kind of alongside John. And I didn't really get a full picture of what God was calling me to do until more recently. He took me through a lot of trials and places where I had to learn to surrender and lay down what I was holding on to. He literally told me to take up running, and I took up running, and it was one of those turning points in my life where he used that time to talk to me and reveal to me that he had a deeper calling for me than just filling in where I could. He revealed to me that we're a pastoral team, and that I was to take on that role.
I remember this distinctly, like it was yesterday, that a coworker of mine who was actually I ran a sales team, and she was one of the members on that team, said to me, "You need to go into full-time ministry." And I ran the other way. I should, I thought she wanted all my clients, and all I could think of was that no way is she going to have that. And I just literally, I should have gone.
There was a significant time of wandering in the desert for both of us, together. I don't know who was leading and who was following, but we weren't following God, that's for sure. But we had that period of just being lost. And but as John said, we came here to the Rock, and it was a real time of just healing and just being able to sit with God again. Without doing that work. We long to do the work of God, but sometimes you need that rest. And that was a time of rest. And it's just kind of like when we got to that place, then he said, okay, here's the real plan for you. He started to reveal that to me. His revelation to me, his revelation to John, took years. His revelation to me took probably about 30 minutes. And that was when he said it to me, when he said, here's what I'm calling you to do. I'm calling you to be a pastor. I said, okay, then let's do it. Let's giddy up. Let's go. But what I didn't realize at that time is when he planted that in my heart, there was going to be a period after that of preparation. Yes. And purification, and that it's painful. It's very painful. It's a time of really realizing that you have to lay down so many things that you don't even know you're holding on to. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. And I don't think you really understand the magnitude of what that means until God really calls you and hits you between the eyes and says, I want you to trade your dreams for my dreams. And you need to lay down everything else. And that's been a hard process. And it's one that, has taken a while. And, it's one that I'm sure we'll continue to go through. But it's worth it.
I look around and I see such a need for God and how we need to help people find their way back to God. And I just want to be a part of that.
Now, here's the good news. Most of us are not going to get thrown off a boat and swallowed up by a big fish and spit out on the shore of a distant land. But if we do not respond to the calling that God has in our lives, if we run away from that calling, if we repress or push down that calling, we are going to have implications in our lives. If we do that, if we do not respond when God calls us, we are always going to have a place of longing. We're always going to have this gnawing sense of unfulfillment, that we were created for something that we haven't done, that we've left something on the table, if you will. And so I want to encourage us today. I want to encourage us to think significantly about the calling that God has placed on our lives and whether or not we are embracing it, whether or not we are claiming it. Because I have a pretty high suspicion that there are folks in this room today who have not fully embraced their calling from God. That God is calling you in some way to take a significant step. Now, for most of us, many of us, stepping into our calling won't require us to quit our job, leave a law practice, sell our business, and become a local pastor. But there will be something that we're called to. And there will be some intentional step. For some of us, it may be huge and life-changing. For some of us, it may be a small sacrifice that we're called upon to make in order to fulfill and step into calling. But whatever that calling is, it's going to take some intentionality. We're going to have to make a choice, a decision that we are going to stop running away and we're going to embrace that calling that God has put on our lives. And so, if you have been avoiding, hiding from, repressing, or running away from God's calling, this is your come to Jesus moment. This is a moment when you need to spend some time with God and really come to grips with the fact that God has something for you, that God has a calling in your life that you have not really stepped into fully. And I believe He's drawing you in. He's inviting you into a great adventure, to something awesome, something amazing, that once you've taken the step, you'll be so glad you did. I mean, John and Rachel made it clear it wasn't always easy. It isn't always easy. Sometimes there's wrestling, and there are things we've got to lay down, and there can be struggle with that. But it's worth it. And I want you to know today that God is offering you a second chance at your calling. My prayer for you is that you'll take it.